Alright guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to be talking about mainly the 100% BIGA dough, both yeasted and sourdough. But this kind of goes into pre-ferments in general. There's a lot of things about them that can make making a recipe kind of difficult, but I'll make it easier to understand. So what is the BIGA? The BIGA is the Italians' primary pre-ferment that kind of originates from their sourdough starter, which is also known as a Levita Madre, which for the Italians, it was always 45 to 50% hydration versus most of the rest of the world, which is at 100% hydration. So they had a stiffer starter, and when yeast was invented, they kind of just used the yeast to make a stiff pre-ferment because they didn't really understand how yeast worked, and nobody really did at the time. So they had a lot of great doughs come out of this, and I'm going to start with a pretty standard example here of a 70% hydration dough at 3% salt. Your basis for the BIGA is 1% fresh yeast or condensed yeast, which is what that CY is. One half of that would be active dry yeast, so 5 grams or 0.05%, and one third of that would be instant yeast, which would be 0.033% or 3.3 grams. In place of that, you can use 10% sourdough starter. You can use a combination of both. If you are going to use a liquid sourdough starter or 100% hydration sourdough starter, you're going to want to add 50 grams of flour to make it 50% hydration for the BIGA. So when it comes down to it, all of the flour is going to be used for the BIGA in this case, and 500 grams of water will be used for the BIGA, but there's still a remaining 200 grams of water, so that will go in the final mix. And if you're making a yeasted BIGA dough, you're going to add some yeast in the final mix, about a half to a third of what you did in the BIGA. If you're doing it with sourdough, it's just going to be the first half of water. It's going to be on speed 1. You're going to bring it together, and then on speed 2, the second half of the water with the salt dissolved into the water. So here's another graphic of me kind of going over it again. And you can start with the water in the yeast or the flour in the yeast and do whatever. You can do it in any order to make your BIGA. It's actually really simple. I'm going to show you after a few more slides. You're just going to kind of mix it till there's no dry flour. If you're doing it yeasted, I would leave it out for an hour room temperature and then 12 to 48 hours CT, controlled temp, in the fridge. But if you're using a sourdough starter, I would leave it out for anywhere from 12 to 18 hours tops, and keep it room temperature. So keep in mind that if you're going to use a room temperature BIGA, you're going to want to use cold water in the final dough. And if you're going to use a cold BIGA, you're going to want to use room temperature water in the final dough to get your final dough temperature to something that is in the safe zone. So here's something else. For instance, 100% BIGA would use all of the flour in the recipe, where 100% Poolish couldn't use 100% of the flour, or else your whole dough would be 100% hydration. So for 100% Poolish, it's going to use 100% of your water, as it's more hydrated than your dough, and 100% BIGA will use 100% of your flour, as it's less hydrated than your dough. If your pre-ferment is the same hydration as your dough, which could be a BIGA, but mostly people would refer to it as a fermentolyse, as it's like autolyse with the leavening agent in there. If you have something that's equally hydrated, then in the final dough, you would have no more flour and water to add. You would just add your salt and your oil and sugar, whatever else you might add to your dough. But in this case, we are focused on the BIGA, which is less hydrated than our dough. So we will be adding the water in the final dough. Alright, so let's get into making a BIGA, and I'm going to start at the restaurant making a little bigger of a batch of a yeasted a BIGA here. So I'm going to start with about 5 kilograms of flour. and I'm going to throw that in, whichever flour you plan to use for your dough. But for pre-ferments, I'd prefer something stronger just to handle the fermentation that has no control of salt. So yeah, 5 kilos. I'm gonna use I'm using instant yeast, so I'm gonna use 1/3%. So at 5 kilos, I would be using 16 grams, 15 grams, and 2.5 kilos of water. And I mix it with the spoon for a little, just till I can get to a point where my hands won't get disgusting. And then I go in with my hands when it's all kind of dry. And I'm just putting it together very gently. I'm not trying to knead the dough. I'm not pushing it down or squeezing it on top of each other. I'm pretty much just lifting up these little strands and picking them back down and moving them around and shaking it, you know. The goal is just not to have a big mass of dry flour. The less the better. Shaking helps kind of have a catch on the biga. So do whatever you got to do, play with it, get to know it, you know. It's always good to get your hands in there. And in not that much time at all, you should have a biga that comes together. So for yeast, it's pretty straightforward. It's going to be 1% fresh yeast of your flour, half the weight of your flour and water, and then you just do this. So it's pretty easy. It does take 5 to 10 minutes of just making sure it's shaken well. Don't be lazy on this step. I would actually try to make sure you do a good job. But notice I'm not squeezing the dough or really agitating it. I'm just kind of moving it around just to get the dry flour together. Here is a sourdough biga. I'm going to start with my water on this one, and start with 500 milliliters of water, 100 grams of starter. I'm going to mix that in, and I'm trying to make like a cream with the water and the starter. So you can use your hands and stuff. Get it all together, boom, boom. The more you break up the starter, it kind of helps, and the little starches that come off spread throughout the water, making your whole dough get fermented like you want. I'm going to add my flour right on top, shake it up a little bit, and then I just go in with my hands on this one. Kind of do everything different every single time because I'm a weird fella. I'm a fart smeller. Anyways, get right back to it, doing my thing. I give it, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes just to make sure it's good, you know. This is a very easy, relaxing job. It's not very taxing. But keep in mind, all my flour for the dough are in these bigas. So here's the yeasted one. Come back the next day in the morning. And I actually did, for this one, transfer it to a greased dough tray so it would pop out easier, but you don't have to do that. And you can cut it with a knife. You can see this one breaks apart pretty easily, which is nice. But you don't want to just throw the whole mass into your mixer. You could cause some problems. The more you tear it or open it, the more you have the pores be able to catch the water you're going to throw in there, which helps with the phase 1 of the mixing. So yeah, I'm tearing it up into smaller pieces. I'm not making it bite size, but I'm making it smaller than it is. And yeah, I'm going to fill the bowl with that first. And I got a lot of biga over here. I was playing with a Sicilian recipe. We don't really sell Sicilians on the menu anymore. We used to, so now I kind of just almost play with a different recipe every time to make them. And I was very, very pleased with the 100% biga recipe. That is kind of where I get some of my creativity and experimentation, is from making dough for Sicilians. I can always use the pizza dough too if I'm ever in a hurry, but sometimes it's nicer to use a 70% hydration dough for bread than a 55-ish percent hydration dough for bread. But yeah, you can see it actually built some gluten in that time. I mean, quite a bit, to be honest, but it's not like I mechanically needed a bunch of it. And you know me, if it's in the recipe, it is going in the bowl, so that is not going to be wasted. Let's get all that in there. Okay, bada bing, bada boom. Wonderful. I have the rest of my water broken in half. Like I said, half is going to be with the yeast, half is going to be with the salt. And this BIGA was in the fridge. It's a yeasted BIGA, so the water will be room temperature. And I believe I used 15 grams for the BIGA, which was pretty close to 0.33%, 0.033%. And, oh yeah, 0.33%, I'm sorry. And then 0.1% basically for the final dough here. And so once you get the first half of your water and your BIGA in, you're just going to mix on the slow speed or speed 1 for anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes, just till it kind of comes together as a dough. And you want to make sure you don't have any tough clumps from your BIGA in there. This is the time to get them out. It will mix into your dough, so just be patient. But 8 minutes, you should be pretty good there. I look at it, not happy yet, so I let it go a little bit longer. But yeah, this is one of those doughs you can't just always go with the timer. You do have to look at it, if you know what I mean. Like for me, I got a lot to do in the morning, but I'm not really leaving this area too much. I try to write a few things on a prep list, but didn't get that far. So now is when I'm going to stir the salt in the second half of my water. And this kind of helps give the elasticity for the gluten, mixing the salt in with the water and adding it gradually. It also helps the dough kind of absorb both, where if you throw the dry salt in, sometimes it just stays on the outside, where this should get it throughout the whole dough. And got to give it a real feel. Still feels a little clumpy to me, so keep it going. And also, if you do stir your salt in, it can turn back into salt at the bottom of the container, so just stir it again right before you start really using it. And this is an old mixer, so I throw some water in first before turning it to speed 2, because I don't want an insane amount of friction to possibly mess up the motor in a mixer that is not mine. So that is a good way to kind of protect yourself, is just get a little bit of the water in first. And you cannot add all of this water in this phase at once. It's just not feasible. You have to go gradually. I can't emphasize that enough. To make good dough, sometimes you do have to babysit it. For a lower hydration direct dough, you can kind of just set it and forget it. 7-8 minutes later, it's fine. This dough is 70% hydration, and you are really building the gluten, but not overworking it if you do it right. You basically add a tiny bit of water. As you see, I'm waiting and waiting very patiently to be able to throw a little more water in. And while the outside of the dough is shiny and wet, it is not time to add more water, but once it looks back more like a regular dough would, that's when you're definitely ready to add some more water, which I do now. And I mean, that was barely a drip, and it takes a few minutes before I even get the second drip in. So this part really took me about 10 minutes just to get all the water in speed 2. And you'll notice on my mixer on the next dough, it didn't even take close to that long. Yeah, to give a frame of reference, the mixer that I bought is 159 RPM, and this Hobart on speed 1 is 112, and on speed 2 is about 200. So it's right around 1.5 in terms of the speed on my Vivor or Vivor. I have no idea how you pronounce it. But the dough is done. I added all the water, and you can see what is so cool about this dough and the way you bring the structure. It is truly done mixing, and by adding that water, you're able to get way more mixing time in without overworking it. And notice the dough does not stick to my hands at all. So I'm going to take the the hook or horn, whatever you want to call it, out. And I can literally just one shot all the dough on the table. And at the end, you're going to do kind of a coiled fold movement. Basically just lifting up at the middle and trying to make it into one big ball. Pretty mandatory last step, just to make sure you can get the last little beauty touches to it. And look at that smooth ball. Look at my clean hands. You can always cover it with the bowl if you're using a Hobart like this. That's one thing I do like about it. Alright, now to show you guys my new toy. So I got my Sourdough BIGA over here, and I let this thing go. I let this thing go 18 hours room temperature. It was airy. It was smelling good. And this made one of the airiest doughs ever. I honestly was completely amazed that I could get the kind of crumb that I got from sourdough, and this was definitely the way to do it. Maybe I could try like 100% Madre dough or something, which essentially is the same thing, but a couple different steps, you know. But this is the Sourdough BIGA here. This is basically what they did before they knew what to do with yeast. And they did find it had its advantages in terms of flavor and airiness. But yeah, I mean, the wetter the pre-ferment, usually the more flavor it gives off. So, and by flavor I do mean acidity a lot of times. So this is more yeasty than bacterial, so you'll get more of a sweeter flavor, more mild and kind of actually yeasty, similar to the taste of commercial yeast without using commercial yeast, which is kind of cool. But yeah, once again, everything in the recipe is going in there. You can see it did build some gluten. It didn't stiffen up as much as the yeasted one, partially because it never went in the fridge to stiffen up, sorry. And yeah, it's really easy to scrape the BIGA off your dough trays. I like doing it on a flat container when I make them. Makes it easier to get out, makes it easier to make. If you do it in a very deep container, you might have big clumps of hydrated flour, and the opposite as well, where this is more uniform across the whole thing. So yep, once again, getting all of the BIGA in the bowl, even what's on my hands. And look at that beautiful spiral mixer. So there's the first half of the water. This is sourdough, so I'm not adding any yeast. And I get it to the pumpkin, the lovely pumpkin that I never get to see in the Hobart. Once I get it there, that's when I'm going to stir the rest of the salt into the second half of the water. And in this, I'm using a room temperature Sourdough BIGA, so I am using cold water. I actually chilled the water in the fridge overnight, and I kept an eye on the temperature of the dough as I went, and this came out perfectly. So you could pretty much just do the same thing. Once again, I add a little bit, and you can see how much quicker it is before I can add more water when you use a mixer like this, and how much easier it is to add it, as you're not trying to dodge any hook. You can just drop it in on the other side. But since it needs it so evenly, it really didn't take long for this to come together. It was actually probably about 5 minutes at a speed that's even slower than speed 2 on the Hobart. So yeah, as you saw, I had my little temp gun. I can check the temperature of the dough. And this one did end at 78.9 degrees Fahrenheit, which is somewhere around 24 degrees Celsius, I believe. And you kind of want something between 77 and 81 degrees. I did this one time with room temperature, and it came to like 82, 83 degrees. So yeah, if you're using the cold water, it gives you just enough to make it work in this method. So I'm getting closer to the pumpkin once again, and all the water, the last of the water is absorbed, and that's starting to look like a pumpkin, which is enough for me. And so pretty soon I stop the mixer. Yep, and you can see the gluten is very strong once again. One downside about this is you can't really just take the bowl off. You can't take the hook off as easily. So I was fighting with this dough. I mean, the gluten was so strong, I could barely rip it off the hook and then off the wall. And it felt almost kind of sticky, probably because I let the BIGA go for 18 hours room temperature. But it still didn't really leave much on my hand, just kind of made some quick movements. Didn't really stick to the table, as you can see, and still came out very smooth with the final dough temperature of about 79 degrees, right smack in the middle of the zone you're looking for. And here I did a little different. I put some oil on it before I covered it, but it doesn't make a difference. You can do it however you want. Sometimes I like to do it like this to let the oil really soak into the dough somewhat, so when I'm rolling it, it's not full of oil. Usually I oil before I cover, but you can do whatever you want. I recommend doing it before you cover because it absorbs in, whereas here I covered it and then oiled it after, and I added probably a little too much oil, making it a little harder to roll, but no biggie really. One good thing about oil is it doesn't stick to your hands, but too much oil, it doesn't stick to itself to where it will close properly. So I was on the cusp of having too much here, but still had a decent amount to where I could still close the dough. And I'm weighing out big 2-pound dough balls for Sicilians in this case. And the other one I cut the recipe into 6 and made 6 small pizzas, small to medium size. But yeah, this dough is great for like pretty much anything. So yeah, some of them I just roll on the table here, kind of get them a little pre-shaped. I do love when you kind of push the mixer to its limit and push the dough to its gluten limit by adding the water gradually. You get a totally different kind of dough because the gluten's developed so perfectly that I can pick this up at 70% hydration and roll it without getting dough all over my hands. It doesn't stick to my hands. It's super easy. For any of you guys that want to make this without a mixer, I honestly don't recommend it, but if you have the patience to add a little bit of water, knead it in by hand, which could take some time, add a little bit more water and knead it in by hand. I mean, you could do it, but I wouldn't recommend that. Maybe go for something like 100% Poolish, where, as I explained before, all of your water would be in the Poolish, and you would only add your flour, salt, and whatever else you add to your dough at the end if you are doing it by hand. If you have a mixer, I highly recommend you give this a shot, as this is one of the funnest doughs I've ever had the luck to do. Special thanks to the restaurant I work at letting me use their mixer for things like this, and Vivor for getting me a mixer. Well, I mean, I bought it, but cool company to sell a cheap mixer like that works well. Also notice the crumb shot that I have in the thumbnail is from this Sourdough BIGA, and that is the best crumb I ever got at any kind of sourdough pizza, so I was very happy with that. I hope you guys enjoyed. Give this a shot.